Mr. President, this week I received several requests from international advocate groups to speak out against the injustice in other countries in regards to their judicial system. It's not unusual that we get requests here in the United States to speak out on those matters, where journalists are imprisoned solely because they're doing investigative journalism, or human rights activists are imprisoned just because they speak out about the injustice in their society, or people in opposition to the government are arrested or harassed or tortured because they disagree with the government, and the judicial system of that country is unable to deal with those types of issues. They understand that one of America's core values is fairness, inclusion, and equal justice under the law. However, recent events have shown that here in the United States, we're not where we need to be in regards to our judicial system, and we must do more. Shortly after the tragic death of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed youth who was killed by an auxiliary police personnel, I convened a group of activists in Baltimore to try to understand what is happening in our community. And I must tell you, what I observed and learned during that discussion, I think is very informative to us all. It was an African-American audience, and they were explaining to me that if you have a teenage son in the African-American community, you've got to talk to that son about what they need to do in regards to their potential confrontation with police. And it was chilling to me to understand the fear that's in our community as to how you have to deal with law enforcement. Law enforcement should be on your side. And yet it sort of ripped me apart to understand how widespread the concern is in minority communities. How widespread the number of victims of racial profiling in minority communities. How many families have had examples. There was this one young woman who was there told me that when she was a young girl, she was going to the arena to see a basketball game with her father, and how her father was pulled over for no reason other than the color of his skin, pulled aside, unable to proceed to the basketball game. And the impact it had on this young girl at the time about, is this America? Is this the core values we believe in equal justice under the law? One of the victims of racial profiling was a young lawyer who was returning home from a funeral that he was attending. And he was stopped by the Maryland State Police solely because of the color of his skin, no other reason. He decided to do something about it. He brought a legal suit against the Maryland State Police, Wilkins versus State of Maryland. As a result of that lawsuit, a consent order was entered into where the Maryland State Police committed itself to stop racial profiling. There were certain practices that had to be established, certain checks that had to be done, certain data had to be provided. And it became, I think, the model example of what law enforcement needs to do to make sure that it is not using racial profiling. I mention that case because Robert Wilkins, the young lawyer who brought that case, has been confirmed by the United States Senate and now sits on the D.C. Court of Appeals, one of the confirmations that we are able to complete in this term of Congress. He's an excellent member of the Court of Appeals for the district. But we get constant reminders about the problems we have in our criminal justice system. Ferguson, Missouri, of course, and the tragic death of Michael Brown gives us another example. And I'm a strong supporter of the independence of our judicial branch of government and the grand jury system. But I think all of us understand the frustration. No criminal indictments brought in Trayvon Martin, none brought in Michael Brown, none brought in the most recent Eric Garner, unarmed individual who was choked to death in New York. Unfortunately, there are many, many more examples where the criminal justice system does not appear to be working for equal justice for all. In Oakland, California, the NAACP reported that out of the 45 officers involved in shootings in the city between 2004 and 2008, 37 of those shot were black, none were white. 1/3 of the shootings resulted in fatalities. Although weapons were not found in 40% of the cases, no officer were charged. No wonder people are losing confidence that we really do have a system where all of our citizens are treated equally under the law. I do point out that the Department of Justice is investigating the circumstances in Ferguson and Michael Brown, so we'll wait to see what happens with the federal investigation. But the initial suspicions in many of these cases were solely because of the color of a person's skin. That's why the individuals were stopped. Not because they were observed in criminal activities, not because they had specific information about a crime that fit the description of the individual that was stopped. That's profiling. And profiling is wrong. Profiling is when the police target an individual, start an investigation, do things because of race, religion, national origin. That is wrong. Doesn't work. If you have specific information about a crime, obviously you can use that identifiers to deal with the investigation. That's appropriate. But if you don't have specific information, then it's profiling. And profiling is just plain wrong. It's un-American. It's not what we believe in. It's not in our core values. It's a waste of resources because it doesn't help you solve a problem. It turns communities against law enforcement, and you need communities working with law enforcement if we're going to have the most efficient law enforcement, and it can be deadly, as we have seen too frequently in recent years here in the United States. Profiling must end. Mr. President, the Attorney General issued some guidance today on profiling. And I say, look, there are some things in there that I found very helpful. For the first time, this Justice Department guidelines will cover new categories such as national origin, gender identity, religion, and sexual orientation, while closing certain loopholes and narrowing some exemptions. The guidance mandates new data collection, which makes it easier to track profiling complaints. They're all positive. For the first time, we now have specific guidelines against profiling, but it only applies to the federal agencies. We need to act because only we can make it apply not just to the federal, but the state, the local auxiliaries. We can close all loopholes so that we do not allow profiling to take place in America as we should. And we can give a private right of action so that we can have enforcement of the laws that we pass. That's what we should do. I've introduced legislation that does exactly that, the End Racial Profiling Act, S. 1038. I'm proud to have as co-sponsors Senator Reed, Durbin, Blumenthal, Coons, Harkin, Menendez, Stabenow, Levin, Mikulski, Warren, Boxer, Gillibrand, Arona, Wyden, Murphy, and Whitehouse. And I'm proud that in the United States House of Representatives, the lead sponsor is John Conyers, who's been an iconic figure in the fight for civil rights, H.R. 2851, 59 co-sponsors in the House bill. The legislation that we've authored would provide training and mentoring for police departments so that they have what they need. It prohibits all forms of profiling. It provides for data collections and provides grants to develop best practices. It has broad support, including the support of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the ACLU, the NAACP, and the Rights Working Group. Mr. President, as I started my comments on the floor, America is the beacon for hope for people all around the world. They embrace our core values because they know what America stands for. It stands for every one of us being treated fairly under our laws. I'm proud of our values, and I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish as a nation, where we can enjoy religious freedom, where people can speak out however you want to in your government. But let us take care of business first at home and recognize that we are not where we need to be. Recent events where people have lost their lives and our system is not working needs to be corrected. One thing we can do is pass the End Racial Profiling Act. As Senator Kennedy said, civil rights is the great unfinished business of America. We can end profiling by passing legislation. I encourage my colleagues to work with me so we can end profiling and move us one step closer to equal justice under the law for all Americans. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.